Professor Beito.
Hello.
Congratulations on your new book.
Well, thank you.
And I'm very glad that you've joined the company of those eminent historians who debunk the myths surrounding FDR. So your new book is called simply FDR, A New Political Life. So the thing that the more I learn about the history of World War II, and Roosevelt mostly interests me in respect of World War II, I can't understand why people are still enchanted by FDR, why they keep believing that he saved the world from the Nazis, that without him the Soviet Union would have fallen, that he ended the Great Depression, and all these other myths that have been debunked again and again, and you do a very good job debunking them once more. Why these myths persist?
I think people need heroes, and I guess people who, you know, uh, agree with a lot of FDR's policies sort of embrace him because FDR, was very much an advocate of a bigger government view. He had a lot of flowery rhetoric about civil liberties. He talked about the four freedoms, and he was very charming. Uh, he was an aristocrat, and I think a lot of people kind of looked up to this aristocrat who they thought was looking out for the people, right? That he was concerned for Americans. He was performing public service. But I think this view of FDR is vulnerable to criticism because in my own discussions, I've brought up Japanese internment. I've brought up his very poor civil rights record. I've brought up his very poor economic record. If FDR had left office after two terms, would he be regarded very highly by anybody? Unemployment was still in double digits. So when I push back on these questions, I find an inability of people to respond, an inability of people to justify their feelings about FDR. So I think he could be in a position like Woodrow Wilson was only about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, where you would have presidential ranking, and Wilson tended to be ranked in the top 10. And now he has very few defenders left comparatively. And I think that's going to eventually happen to FDR because it's very hard to mount a defense of his record, right? Because it's filled with hypocrisy, it's filled with failure, and it's filled with a kind of icy cynicism that especially impressed me, kind of a coldness. In fact, I'm not the only one to say this. None other than Harry Truman said that FDR was the coldest man he ever met. That's coming from someone who knew him pretty well.
You say people need heroes. Now that phrase stuck in with me because the situation was somewhat similar with Churchill in Great Britain, and Churchill was voted the greatest Briton, although Churchill's policies were disastrous for Britain and for the British Empire and for the world, really. All credible authors agree that he bankrupted Britain, that he pursued a pointless war, that the clever thing to do was to leave the two totalitarian monsters, that of the Soviet Union and of Nazi Germany, to fight each other, as Truman was proposing before he became president. And yet Churchill in Britain is as revered as Roosevelt in the United States. So no amount of arguments seem to help. I was reading recently George R. Jordan's book, From Major Jordan's Diaries, and he lists the depressing list of land lease that was given to the Soviet Union of of unconditional help that not only ensured the Soviet Union can easier win in the war, but that ensured the Soviet Union would be a really dangerous adversary during the Cold War. I mean, it goes a page after page, not just enormous quantities of material of different automobiles and weaponry and resources, but whole factories really, who were used by the Soviet Union for many years after the war. And by the way, some of the American boys who were killed in the Korean War were killed with American weapons, who were given by United States free of charge to the Soviet Union. And I was also reading Viktor Suvorov's books, and Viktor Suvorov is he was an officer of the Soviet military intelligence, and his job was to recruit agents in the West, either by paying them money or by threatening them, by exposing some secrets they had, or by using other shady methods. So he knows how the Soviet intelligence worked. He had first-hand experience, and he proposed the hypothesis that the behavior of Roosevelt cannot be explained just in terms of stupidity. That maybe he was blackmailed in some way by Stalin. He doesn't go as far as to say that Roosevelt was a Soviet agent, but he says that Roosevelt was so much helping Stalin, and that was so idiotic that it cannot possibly be explained by simply in terms of Roosevelt being a fool. So what do you think about this hypothesis? Do you think that Roosevelt was just foolish to help the Soviet Union so much, or was there something more there?
I think foolish is one word you could use. Another word is that he thought Stalin was to be trusted. So I guess that does make him foolish. And ideologically, he was more in tune with Stalin, because someone used to say years ago that the problem that many on the left have with communism is not that they have good intentions, but that they have too many good intentions, that they go too far. So I think he also had a kind of, I don't know what you'd say it, a view of himself, that he was a charmer. And after all, he had charmed the American people, and that he could charm Stalin. He could handle Stalin. He could work with Stalin. And there was a very famous example, I think this was at Tehran, where Roosevelt said, some of our Americans call you Uncle Joe. Can I call you Uncle Joe? And according to Roosevelt's account, Stalin came around the table and shook his hand. And Roosevelt was very taken with that. Now, I've heard other accounts that Stalin did not appreciate this, but who knows? I think Stalin knew that Roosevelt was naive. I think he played to Roosevelt's ego. So I don't think he was a fool. I don't think Roosevelt was paid off, blackmailed. It's possible.
No, by the way,
Suvorov, I think it's more that he was naive.
Suvorov doesn't propose that he was paid off, but Suvorov proposes that maybe Roosevelt had some secrets that the Soviet intelligence used to influence him.
That's possible. I mean, there were things about him that if they had been publicized, could have gotten him in trouble. The interesting thing about blackmail is, I think that's the word that you could use with Roosevelt and Churchill, very specifically on the Morgenthau plan. Now, Churchill, I'm not a fan of Churchill, but he thought this plan was insane. And the Morgenthau plan was proposed by Secretary of the Treasury Morgenthau, basically reflecting Roosevelt's ideas, and that was to punish Germany, to deindustrialize Germany, to make the post-war Germany into a agrarian society. They were even prohibited commercial aircraft. And there was, he basically, in his words, wanted to castrate Germany because his belief was that they had this aristocracy that completely needed to be destroyed, that was sort of in their genes. And Churchill, when he found out about this plan, said, I can't go for this. This would be chaining Britain to dead Germans. This is madness. And he held out for a little while. Then finally, it was clear that if Churchill did not go along with the Morgenthau plan, he would not get Lend-Lease money. And at one point,
you say something interesting that Roosevelt was hoping to charm Stalin, and if some human believes that he could charm a snake, this human will not be simply called foolish or naive. This human will be called mentally deficient, not mentally deficient, crazy, really. I mean, how idiotic. This is idiotic to believe that you could charm somebody like Stalin. And Roosevelt should have known something about the biography of Stalin. Stalin double-crossed all people he ever made deals with. All people in his own party, all people in the Soviet Union. He double-crossed Hitler using the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He tricked Hitler into this war. Stalin was always calculating. He was never emotional. Stalin was always had a plan, and he didn't care about anybody, but he only cared about his own goals. And yet somehow Roosevelt believed that he would charm Stalin. I mean, how retarded, pardon me, somebody has to be in order to believe something as absurd as this.
Roosevelt had an ego. He believed in his ability to do that, and he succeeded with the American people. So I think in political,
but American people,
thought he could repeat this
were
template.
Not Stalin. The American people were emotional. So he was very good at making speeches. He was very good at charming. I get all this. This is how he made his
money. Using money,
yes,
and patronage.
But
and he
Stalin
thought, well,
was
I'm going to give this
else.
guy all this Lend-Lease money, and he'll like this. He'll be appreciative of this. Going back to 1941,
yes,
billions of Lend-Lease money.
It would be weird to believe that you could use the same tricks you're using to fool your voters on a politician as shrewd as Stalin, somebody who has climbed this greasy pole of Soviet politics and who has stayed there and who had managed to exterminate all those who are against him. I mean, it's one thing to make it is I find it hard to imagine that a politician of the caliber of Roosevelt really believed that you could use speeches in order to achieve something when you're dealing with politicians. I mean, okay, when you're dealing with farmers, with workers, with housewives, okay, you could make this political spectacle. But when you are dealing with other politicians, people who are calculating, who are cynical, who are very self-centered, how could you possibly believe that the same method will work?
Well, Roosevelt is a man of the left, so his default is on the left. Now, he's not a communist, but I think, as I said, he's more forgiving of Stalin because he sees him as, somebody that's, maybe has the same end goal. Now, an interesting issue here is the contrast between his treatment of Stalin and Churchill. As I was saying, on the Morgenthau plan, Churchill was against it, but Roosevelt made clear that he would not extend Lend-Lease money to Churchill unless he went along with the Morgenthau plan. Churchill got so desperate that he said at one point, "What do you want me to do? Beg like Fala?" Fala, of course, was Roosevelt's dog. Humiliated Churchill. Churchill ended up agreeing with the Morgenthau plan, signed on to it, got his Lend-Lease money. Yalta, Roosevelt could have easily and quite effectively, I think, used Lend-Lease money in the same way against Stalin. He could have said, okay, I want you to agree to free elections in Poland or whatever, right? He could say this, and he said, if you don't, I'm not going to extend, more billions of Lend-Lease dollars, which kept going till I think 1946.
Yeah,
And
that's a very
he
good
didn't even
point.
think of doing that. He didn't
He
even
was he
consider
was
doing
always
that.
accommodating to horrible to a horrible
Yeah.
dictator like Stalin. He was not accommodating to another democracy.
Yes,
So
and I think that in some ways that friendship is overrated. The
and
importance of that friendship is overrated between Churchill and it was a relationship, a patronage relationship
and
to
then
a great
there's
extent.
and then there's this another idiotic idea to industrialize Germany. I mean, Germany is on the front line the of this fight between the free world and socialism. So if you deindustrialize Germany, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot. I mean, how idiotic that idea is, because most of Germany was still in the Western zone. So most of Germany, if Germany was
Mhm.
deindustrialized, the West would have been disarmed. Germany could have been used as this bulwark against the Soviet Union. And yet, Roosevelt again was serving Stalin very well by proposing this idea to industrialize Germany, which would have made Stalin's job of taking over Western Europe much easier.
And of course, Stalin physically removed German industrial plants toward the Soviet Union and rebuilt them. He stripped German industry, and Roosevelt had no particular problem with that. I think the source of this is Roosevelt it's unconditional surrender, which is this rigid idea, not only that you're not going to negotiate, but your enemy has to be destroyed, and that's what basically Roosevelt thought, because he thought the Germans are naturally militaristic, aggressive. There's this aristocracy that had let Hitler come to power. It all needs to be eliminated, and they need to be re-educated. And that was part of the Morgenthau plan. They're going to send American teachers to re-educate Germans because the adults are hopeless. So you've got to re-educate the children. I mean, he really did think this. So it's this kind of view that there's nothing to be preserved. It's all got to be destroyed. And he, has a similar view, I think, towards Japan in many ways and Italy. Not quite as extreme, but pretty extreme. And in Italy, it produces some tragic consequences. There was an opportunity there to get a conditional surrender. And Roosevelt just say, no, it has to be unconditional. And it dragged on and on so long that the Nazis were able to send their forces into Italy and made it a very hard fight for 2 years when there was a small window of opportunity to get a conditional surrender from Italy. Italy wanted to surrender, but they didn't want to humiliate themselves with unconditional surrender, or the Italian leaders did not, who had overthrown Mussolini. Badoglio had overthrown Mussolini and wanted to make a deal with the U.S.
Thomas Sowell, in his book, in his excellent book, Intellectuals and Society, analyzes Roosevelt as another intellectual. Do you agree with this? Of this
Is not
idea
an
that
intellectual?
no, Roosevelt, that Thomas Sowell analyzes Roosevelt as another intellectual. So, do you agree that Roosevelt was an intellectual?
No, I do not. I think he had ideas. I don't think some people portray Roosevelt as he just tries everything. He'll try anything to see if it works. I don't think so. I think he was a progressive. His default was on the left. He admired Woodrow Wilson. Wilson was his mentor, as was Teddy Roosevelt. Having said that, Roosevelt was not a deep thinker. It was said by people that knew him that they never saw that he even read a book. He might have read detective stories and things like that. He was more interested in things like stamp collecting. He would spend hours collecting stamps. He was interested in sort of cloak and dagger mysteries, but he was not an intellectual. But he did have ideas. But he's not an original thinker.
Okay,
There's not much depth to him, I think. He's superficial in a lot of ways. Roosevelt I think, has ideas. I think he's very much the focus is he wants to get elected and he wants power. That's the main focus. But if he can advance an ideological agenda on the left, he will do it if he can. But he's not willing to stick his neck out. He'll back off if he has to.
So he was not an intellectual, but he was very good with words. Again, just like Churchill in Britain. And in my mind, this makes him sort of intellectual because he was good at writing speeches, I guess. Would you agree that?
I don't think he didn't write most of those speeches.
Oh, he didn't?
He would make contributions, but he had speechwriters. And he would sit down with them and he would make suggestions and things like that, make changes, but he did not write his own speeches.
So his contribution to being to his greatest success, being reelected again and again, was that he had this voice. He could deliver these speeches very well. I mean, I would admit, even somebody who cannot stand him, I enjoy listening to his voice.
He was different from
Trump. He had this charisma. He was charismatic. So he was good at this, and I guess he was good at finding the right speech writers. Is that it?
Yeah, and I would say, again, he would not just sit there mindlessly and deliver. He'd make changes. But I think that one thing you see about Roosevelt, very different from Trump. Trump will make personal attacks. He does it all the time. Right? Roosevelt didn't do that very much. And people said that you could kind of enjoy being attacked by Roosevelt because he did it with such style and humor, and there was a subtlety to it. A famous speech is about his dog, Fala. Which, if I ever have students, I say, you want an example of Roosevelt as a speech maker, listen to the Fala speech. It's brilliant. So he's very good at kind of implying things and making caricatures, but he's also very good at not making it personal. So he gives this impression he's sort of above the fray. He's the wise leader in Washington who's sort of looking out for poor people. My parents were big admirers of Nelson Rockefeller. And why? They were Democrats. They admired Rockefeller because they said, he doesn't have to do this. He doesn't have to go out there and, serve as a politician. He could just, enjoy his money. And I think that a lot of people have the same idea about Roosevelt. He's charming. He's aristocratic. I don't know if you ever saw an old show called Gilligan's Island. Did you ever see that?
I've heard of it. So Roosevelt was not
a millionaire who's even sounds like Roosevelt, and he's kind of a selfish asshole, but he's very much got this aristocratic air. He went to Harvard. He had the best education. So did Roosevelt. Went to Groton and went to Harvard. Elite education.
But they really believe that a politician is not power hungry, that a politician wants to be elected and re-elected and stay in power forever if possible, just out of the goodness of his heart. I mean, this is very naive. Politicians are always power hungry.
Much money to begin with. Roosevelt didn't have that much money. He wasn't a very wealthy guy. He was well off, right? He wasn't a Rockefeller or anything like that. So, I think he gained financially by being president, right? But I don't think that was his main motivation. Main motivation was power. He wanted the power. He did not want to give it up.
Well, of
even though
course,
his health was
somebody
horrible.
who wants to be reelected again and again, if possible for a fourth term, of course, he should be characterized as power hungry.
He was a dying man and he ran for reelection. Anyone who's reasonably objective would have said this is a dying man. And I don't know if Roosevelt knew it or not. If he knew it, he didn't act like he knew it, but he had all the evidence
Well,
from,
as
yeah.
far as I remember, he was hiding it. He was even successfully hiding that he is in a wheelchair.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that wasn't just him. I think that the reporters, the media, they did not report on that. And you could say, well, they thought that really wasn't pertinent. I suppose that's an argument. But he had worse problems than that. They were covered up. He was found laying on the floor of the White House several times by servants because he'd fallen out of his wheelchair. He was a health disaster, right? He had a quack as a doctor who said whatever he wanted. Probably was like Joe Biden's doctor, just was incompetent but very effective. And they finally, Roosevelt's daughter finally insisted they bring in a specialist who really knew what he was doing. And the guy's report on Roosevelt was this guy has just got god awful health. He's at death's door, but yet he ran for reelection. And so
So,
that was covered up. But there were doctors that examined Roosevelt that said this guy is unfit.
so to put this in context, who were the men who were ruling the world during this most important event of the 20th century, World War II? It was Roosevelt, who was sick, physically sick. It was Churchill.
And
Who,
Churchill noticed that Roosevelt was in bad health too. Yeah,
okay, but
yeah,
Churchill, I was about to say that Churchill was an alcoholic, and
yeah.
he had other issues. Uh, Hitler, I don't even want to start about Hitler because the mental issues there were off the chart, and of course Stalin, who was in some respects brilliant, but at the same time there was no humanity there. He was a horrible person, maybe the worst person in history. So these were the people who held the the world in
Mhm.
their hands at this particular moment, when tens of millions of people were dying during an event that determined the outcome of the 20th century. By the way, we are still living with the with the consequences of World War II. Even what happens today in Russia, the fact in Ukraine and other places, this could be connected to what happened in the 40s. How come people are charmed by politicians who don't have the necessary quality to lead their countries? How does this work?
I wish I knew that. I will say one thing about these three politicians is that the worst period really was the last year of the war in many ways, in terms of the destruction and death and the Holocaust and the rest of it. And this was needless, right? Because there were plots going on in Germany to overthrow Hitler. And Roosevelt was coldly belittled these plotters like von Stauffenberg and others who were at high levels of the German government. He refused to give them any support. He was callous towards them. And I think we could see the same in Italy after the overthrow of Mussolini by one of his generals. And Roosevelt's view was, well, I don't really, want to negotiate with these people except if they give in completely. So the worst suffering of all was in the last year of the war. And I'm not really answering your question because I really don't have an answer to it.
Professor Beito, thank you very much for this conversation. Uh, Again, I'm very glad that somebody as eminent as you has joined this fight to bring the truth ultimately uh, to the people, because It is so sad, not only what these people did, but it is actually also very sad that the vast majority of those who live, of our contemporaries, are not aware of this. They still view them as heroes, and they were no heroes. They were self-serving, they were vain, and they were inept. Thank you very much for talking to me, Professor Beito.
Well, thank you.